Those of you that are just joining us, in the chat box, there is our Padlet for today. Today's question is, what is the most disturbing ancient medical procedure you read about? And so this is talking about the article that was on the asynchronous classroom, or the asynchronous assignment, 7 unusual ancient medical techniques. So you'll pick one that you felt was the most disturbing, and what were the consequences? Like, now that we look back and we're looking at all the things that could go wrong with that procedure, what were the consequences of it? Like, what were the risks? So you have a couple minutes. When you finish that, go over to our Google Classroom when you're done and open up the where did I not put it for a class? This is for, I don't think I linked it for, yeah, I did. If you go to Wednesday, and I'll edit the assignment so it's not so hard to find. You're going to open up those slides, and I'll tell you what to do with them here in a sec. So we're answering the warm-up, and then we're going to check with Google Classroom. You've got a couple minutes until 11:20. You need to get a drink of water, get something, a snack. Head over to the restroom. We'll start at 11:20. For those of you that are just joining us, you're going to check into the chat box, and you're going to go to that Padlet. I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quickly so I can start getting your names for attendance. Okay, so Gio, I've got you as here. Let's see. Okay. Since I'm recording it, I have all your names there. Make sure you put your names on the Padlet also, so I know who it is. Okay. That way I'll count you present for synchronous. While you guys are wrapping that up, a couple of, I guess, announcements. So I enjoyed getting to read your introductions. I know some of y'all I may have had as a student in the past, so it was kind of neat to revisit who you are again, and get to know more about you. And then if it's the first time that we meet, it was kind of, I enjoyed getting to put a name to a face, since I don't get to do that during the sessions, and to learn about the things that you enjoy. So thank you for sharing that with me. You'll see the grades on Google Classroom or on Skyward this weekend. So you should see that go in. If you turn it in, it's 100. So you'll get that. And then you'll also have a grade for the day 1 Padlet. And then you're going to be getting a participation grade from yesterday's assignment. So yesterday y'all did the Google form. So I'm going to look for if you showed work, and I'll also give you the attendance for that. So I'll be going back and updating the attendance for Thursday based on the names that the students that submitted it. So you'll see some grades there over the weekend reflect. And then for attendance today, I'm going to use today's session. Okay, if you joined us just now or within the last minute or two, here's the link. So I'm going to call in some of y'all in a moment to help me, or to share what you thought about these procedures. Okay. All right, guys, so I'm going to call on you, some of y'all, to share, elaborate a little bit of what you wrote about. Before we get started, I'm gonna share my screen. When reading this at the first glance, I was like, what was wrong with these people? Like, how did they think that any of this would be a good idea? Like draining someone's blood or making holes into their skull. Like that's just so obviously gonna cause harm. But we kind of take it for granted that a lot of what we know um, was not basic knowledge hundreds of years ago. So now we know, okay, if we cut ourselves and we keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding, that's going to result in too much blood loss. We can die. But back then, having too much blood was a problem. Maybe there were evil spirits, or it was a humor that needed to be drained out. So we got kind of also have to put ourselves into that mindset of they didn't really know a whole lot. I also think back to the fact that all of these normal biological processes that take place, they had no understanding of. And let me see if I'm muted. I'm not. Okay. Like for example, I think of pregnancy. Like now, obviously, we know how pregnancy happens, or it's from an egg to meet, and then 9 months later, there's a baby, full term baby that's going to be delivered. But I think about like the women back in time, like when they didn't understand why they were pregnant, and that their abdomen just kept growing, and then a certain amount of time later, there was a human being that they were delivering. Like that must have been really disturbing in a way. Like what is going on? And childbirth was actually one of the number one reasons for death in women because of too much blood loss or infection after delivering. So with that in mind, let's kind of look at some of those ancient medical procedures. I'm going to call on three of you all right now to kind of share that with me, but also why we know now that they're harmful. And then I'm going to also link them to some real, still medical techniques that are still being applied today. Okay, so you guys were working on that Padlet, and I'm going to ask Karina. Karina, which one did you choose and why did you choose it? Or which one did you choose? Why was it disturbing to you? And what are some consequences of that? Can you guys hear me? Or am I muted? Have I been talking to myself this whole time?
We can hear you.
No, we
Oh
can
my
hear
God,
you. We
that
can
happened
hear
to me
you.
second period. Like all of that intro, I was like talking to myself in second period. So I was just making sure. Let me come back. Thank you guys. Let me come back to Karina. Karina, can you hear me? What did you pick? Can you elaborate on that? Okay, Karina, I'm going to come back to you later in the period just to make sure you're still with us. So maybe you're having technical difficulties, but for everyone, make sure that you guys are still present so when I call on you, we can participate. All right, Sylvia, I'm going to skip over to you. We'll check with Karina later in the period. Sylvia, can you share yours and why? What are the consequences of that procedure? Sylvia, can you hear me? You guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, okay,
Yes.
okay. Sylvia, I'm just going to check back in with you. So Sebastian, which one was yours?
Mine was trepanation.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what trepanation is?
Well, basically, they would just drill holes into their skulls.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some reasons were because, well, if they were possessed, they believed they would release evil spirits, but also to relieve of illnesses,
Mm-hmm.
like well, just basic headaches, epilepsy, abscesses,
Mm-hmm.
and blood clots.
Yeah. So what were the consequences of boring holes into the person's skull?
Um, Well, there would be like a lot of bone fragments and skull fractures, but it says here that evidence showed that most patients actually survived the surgery. So,
Right. So some of them survive, but yeah, you could definitely get an infection. The skull's meant to protect the brain from infection, but also from injury. So thank you so much, Sebastian. I want to show you something that was performed not too long ago, actually, as recently as I know 1970, and those are lobotomies. In a way, they're kind of a form of trepanation. And so when somebody had symptoms of a mental disorder, maybe they were schizophrenic, or maybe they were just like had a very animated personality that people didn't find acceptable, they would cause purposeful brain damage in that patient to kind of subdue that behavior. So they would damage their frontal cortex, and sometimes they would grow very catatonic and very calm, which is what they wanted to accomplish. If that person was very difficult to manage or control, they would perform a lobotomy. And so they would take what was similar to an ice pick and put it in through their eye and then just damage that front part of the brain. But it was used as an acceptable procedure in psychology or in psychiatric care. And so that was eventually done away with because it's very unethical, right? You're causing brain damage in the person to control behavior, or to try to treat a mental disorder. So, um, thank you. So, yeah, that's kind of like trepanation in a way. Up until modern times, there was something similar. I'm going to come back here. Karina, are you with us?
Miss Pignon,
Yes.
Sylvia's telling me that she can't hear you.
Oh, so
Yeah, I couldn't hear you for a while. I just fixed it.
how did you fix it?
Just
Oh, I
by
just
like
fixed it
closing the
too.
app and then like going to
Oh,
the Google Classroom and rejoining to that.
okay.
I
Thank
had
you
to
for
test my
sharing.
speakers because I logged out like 3 times and it wasn't working. But then this past time that I got on, I tested my speakers before I got on and then it worked.
Okay. Thank you. So let me put that in the chat box for your classmates I can't hear. Thank you. I see Leslie kind of, you typed it too. Leaving and coming back helps. Okay. Follow Leslie's. Thank you, Leslie. So just let Sylvia know. Um, Thank you for letting me know. That way I'm aware of the situation. Instructions. Thank you. Okay. So since she can't hear me, well, maybe she'll rejoin here in a sec. Karina, are you here? Can you hear me?
Miss Karina was having the same problem as well.
Okay. Thank you. And then, so I'm going to go to Yarive. Yarive, can you give us yours? Yarive.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Uh-huh.
can
Pick.
hear.
Okay. What did you pick?
I put the cannibal cures. For me,
Okay.
that one was the most disturbing.
Yeah, it's pretty nasty, right? To be eating human parts. What are the consequences of that?
Well, people just thought that if they consumed parts of another person, that they got like their spirit, and it would increase like their well-being. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, like you were saying, they didn't have the knowledge and technology that we have now, so that's what they
Mm-hmm.
believe. That's what they went off of. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
for us, it's weird now, but for
Yeah.
them, it
And
was normal.
so what things could go wrong with eating human remains?
I mean, if a person was sick, a person whose blood you drank, you were probably going to get sick too, or you're going to get worse.
Yeah, you're right. So definitely spreading disease, things like that. And I was looking for this. So I don't know if you guys were aware, you probably have heard of it, but there was a group of rugby players. Thank you, Yarive. There was a
Oh,
group of
yeah.
rugby players that crashed into the Andes Mountains, and they were on their way to a tournament. Several of them survived, some of them died. So eventually they ran out of the food that was on the plane, and so they resorted to eating their teammates. And some of them chose not to, some of them did, I mean, 'cause to stay alive. And so the people that survived went on to write about their account of having to eat the human remains. There are still some tribes that will eat human remains, in isolated parts of the world, and there's actually a disorder that they transmit to each other. It's a form of brain damage. It's a very difficult name to pronounce. It starts with a C, but they get diseases from eating other human beings, and so they actually die from that. So definitely not a good idea. But as Agave pointed out, right, they didn't have the knowledge back then, and so they thought it was helping. Let me come back here. So yeah, there was a lot of things that were disturbing, like rubbing someone's feces on you as a form of ointment, mercury to treat STDs, which we know mercury is toxic now. So all these things that were taking place were causing more harm than good. I do want to share maggot therapy with y'all because I think of it kind of like, how in the world are we using maggots and leeches to treat disease, in this day and age? But it almost seems so ancient. Where did the picture go here? I had leech therapy and a maggot. Okay, so I want to show you this video. The other students said they couldn't hear it, but we can kind of see it. So the maggot is the larva of a fly. And so flies will go and leave their little eggs in decomposing corpses, or they'll leave it on decomposing food so that the maggot can feed off of that and then turn into a fly later on. Well, maggots are used to help treat wounds in humans. So if you have a person who has, for example, a festering wound with a lot of dead tissue, rather than maybe amputating the entire leg or entering that or removing that part of the body, they can use maggots to feed off of that dead tissue, remove that tissue, which could lead to infection and complications, and that'll help the person. So let's watch this. The student said that they couldn't hear it, so I'm going to add the subtitles. But this is maggot therapy, and it's used today. So it's kind of odd, right, to think of having these things in your body, eating up all that dead tissue in case of an infection. But yeah, they're still used today. And then the last one I wanted to show you was the leech therapy. So when we get injured, sometimes we get a hematoma. And so hematoma, basically, you're bleeding underneath the skin and it causes swelling. So if you've ever had a bump on your head, also known as a chipote, right, it starts to swell, and that's all of the blood that's accumulating as you burst those vessels open. And so in order to kind of relieve some of that pressure, especially like if it's on a surgical incision, is you put leeches on there, and the leeches will drain the blood by eating it. And so it's kind of almost seems barbaric and ancient, but it's still used today. So as we go through our anatomy lecture today, you kind of keep that in mind also, that a lot of what we know was because humans had to be dissected and studied, and some of the history in medicine is not pretty. Human experiments were conducted on living people to get some physiological reactions, like how is the heart beating, how is digestion happening. But it was a definitely a dark period that gave a lot of information. So let's go ahead and go into our Google Classroom. And you're going to go ahead and open up the last pair of slides. So with our presentation, I think we realized when we met on Wednesday that you already had some answers to the math because second period had already seen it. So when you open yours, you get a blank copy if you want, right, to work with that. Also, you can be working these on a separate sheet of notebook paper. Like that's acceptable too. And what I did is really it's already given to you this way. I added 3 more slides that we're going to be using today and Monday. Because you already have the first 3 filled in, like you did the table and you have a copy of the math, right? All you really need are the next 3 slides. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to get there. But we're opening up that presentation. I think it says Wednesday, Friday, asynchronous or synchronous, and we have the notes. So all this new technology, I've never worked with an interactive notebook like this because I like an actual physical copy of a notebook. And so if I had a document camera up and running, I would be doing it that way. But I don't have access to that right now. So I'm trying to use this Google Slides. So the only thing that I can think of to add more slides to your presentation is for you to copy them onto what you already have. So let's say, for example, you already made a copy of yours. Because see, if I type on here, it's going to type on your copy, right? So if I put hi, it does it to your copy, and that's not what we want. We want you to have your own copy to work with. So what I suggest you do is if you don't have any of these at all, download the whole thing. But if you already have the first three, add the last three to yours. So I'm just going to do this. 1, 2, 3. I'm just doing shift and then I'm highlighting it. Then I'm going to put cut. I'll have to add them back to yours because otherwise it's going to take them out. And then I'm going to add them to my presentation that I already did. Right? So this is where I left off. Right? I only had 3 slides. Let me go ahead and add them. So that's the only thing that I can think of. I mean, if you know a better way, definitely do a better way. But we just want to add those 3 slides to what you already had. So I'll give you a moment to do that. You can also definitely download them. I'm going to fix it because I took them away, right? So they're back. You can download the presentation, or if you're like, nope, I don't feel comfortable with this stuff, you can also just copy what's on the slide on a notebook, on a sheet of notebook paper if you're keeping an anatomy notebook, and you just write the template in your notes. Some, for example, like we're going to be working with this on Monday. So you have a little bit of time for that template to set it up. Okay, so you also have that option. You can definitely print them if that's an option for you and do it that way too. So there are different ways, hopefully, to meet your needs to get that done. But everybody should have access to this presentation at a minimum. And then the goal is to be able to interact with it. So to do that, you're going to have to make your own copy. So you have to go to File, make a copy. If you don't have this presentation at all, like if you weren't here Wednesday or you're just joined us, you want to do the entire thing. But if you already have the first 3 and you were here when we were talking about safety, you're just going to do the selected slides and pick the last 3. Or you could just download the presentation. This session is recording, so if I'm going too fast or if you need a little more time to process that, you can always go back to the video and see that part and pause it. But you can just do, I'll make a copy and then those last 3 slides. So as we go through today, I'm going to be projecting, I'm going to be going along through a PowerPoint. And so as we go through the PowerPoint, I'm going to tell you what you need to write in there or type. I'm not going to do it with you because I'm going to be projecting the PowerPoint, but this should be open or you should be following along on a separate sheet of paper and writing that information down. Okay, so we'll be using this slide today only. All right, so let's get into some actual anatomy, which we have been kind of, but now we're more doing like preliminary stuff. But let's get into anatomy. And so what we're going to start off with today is defining anatomy and defining physiology, because we know the class is named anatomy and physiology, but what exactly do those words mean and how do those terms relate to each other? And so a lot of what we know about anatomy and physiology is from, and we're talking about specifically human anatomy and physiology, is from studying deceased human beings. And so autopsies, very important to getting a first-hand look into the human body. And so autopsies were definitely not acceptable hundreds of years ago because that was desecration of a human body, right? You're cutting into them, you're removing organs. And so that was not allowed. And so it took a while for people, especially students of medicine, to be able to start to dissect human bodies and perform these autopsies. And autopsy literally means to see for yourself, to see for oneself. So these students of medicine were getting to look at how the organ was, where it was positioned, what size it was. Hey, you know what, let's take it out and study how it's put together. And so for anatomy, we're going to see that anatomy, oftentimes it's a non-living human, right? A dead human being that you have to kind of explore. And autopsies give you an opportunity to really view human anatomy. And for those of you that are going to go into medical school, you are going to dissect a human being. It's part of your course because you're going to go and treat humans. So you want to definitely understand how they're put together anatomically. So dissection of a human being is going to be part of medical school. I think the medical school in UTRGV has a little bit of a different program, but most medical schools you'll dissect, you'll perform an autopsy. And then with physiology, we're going to see, so let's go ahead and define the words. With physiology, we're going to see that, well, I'll pause. So anatomy is basically the way that the body's put together. Where is the heart? What size is the heart? And so our heart's in the middle of our chest. It's nestled between the lungs, and it's a little bit to the left. It's like in the center off to the left a little. So when people, for example, say the Pledge of Allegiance and they put their hand over their heart on the left side, the reason they're doing it to the left, it's a little off to the left, but it's not that left. But knowing where it is anatomically, knowing what it looks like, which organs come in pairs, their size, their weight. All of that is anatomy. And so we can see organ location without a microscope. You can see the superficial anatomy of your hand. You can appreciate the anatomy of your nose and eyes without using a microscope. And so we're going to see, and you guys see two bullets, right? That is what we call gross anatomy. Gross, I know it sounds like, ew, yucky, but that just means like you can see that anatomy without a microscope. And then the second bullet, there's microscopic anatomy. We're going to look at that here in a moment. We'll talk about cancer a little bit in biopsies, but there are times where you need to look a little bit further into the human body to look at the cells that are making up that organ for diagnosis of disease. And so we can appreciate the anatomy of the cells and then decide, okay, that's an abnormal cell or that's a normal cell, and then you can diagnose a patient with cancer officially based on the anatomy of the cells from the tumor. And physiology is different. Physiology is how that organ works. So not what the heart looks like, but how the heart beats. What are the electrical impulses? How do the ventricles open and close, and how are they regulated? How do nerve impulses happen? How does muscle contract at a molecular level with actin and myosin to cause a movement? So all of that's physiology. So physiology is more chemistry. It's can be physics. And the thing with physiology, in order to see how the organs work, the specimen has to be alive. The human being has to be alive. So you can see how that organ works. But the challenge is that in order to really look at how that's functioning, and since the organs are internal for the most part, that person, if they're alive, you can't really study that and really get an appreciation for it. I mean, there's a lot of imaging now, right? Like MRIs and CAT scans. But for physiology, you need, for the most part, a live specimen. You need a living person to study it. And so there was a very dark period of time, right? World War II, during World War
The
II, where
Holocaust.
the Holocaust, yes, people were being imprisoned
Yeah.
to as because of their ancestry, or just, they were being put into the concentration camps. And so the Nazis took it upon themselves to study on some of these people that were in these concentration camps. And so some of the physiology that we know, particularly of hypothermia, comes from studies on those individuals. And so because the Russians, I believe, were working with the Germans, they wanted to find a way to get the Russians to survive extreme hypothermia during war. And so what they decided to do was take some of their prisoners from the concentration camps and throw them into freezing cold water for large periods of time, or just leave them out in the cold, out in the elements, and then they would come back and look at their physiological responses. How is their heart working? How's their breathing? And then find a way to revive them in some cases so they could apply that knowledge to their Russian comrades. And so unfortunately, right, that horrible period of time people were being studied on, it did give some of those physiological pieces of information that we know now, because for physiology we do need a living subject. So with imaging now, I would think it's a lot more, it's a lot easier to study physiology, but definitely that happened at that time. There were some human experiments that were going on there. So when we go in here into our table, you guys see the Venn diagram. So anatomy and physiology are different. And here are some things that we could put for each. So for physiology, it's chemistry and sometimes physics. And for physiology, we need a live subject to study how that organ works. So we're looking at how the organs work. We're looking at how body parts work. Like digestion, it has a lot of chemical and enzyme interactions. And so that's physiology. The shape of the stomach, the size of the stomach, the location of the stomach, that's anatomy. So in anatomy, we're going to put that for the most part. I mean, we can definitely see anatomy in a living person, right? You can see anatomy within yourself, but because a lot of the internal organs, right, they're inside the body, you're going to use a dead specimen. You're going to use a cadaver.
So I'm doing it on my on a notepad.
Yeah.
I don't have to do it on this, right? On the nap.
No, you're going to just submit your work, but if you're doing it on a notepad, that's fine. Just make
Okay.
sure that you can take a picture of it with the scanning app. Anatomy doesn't really change. I mean, it's going to change obviously as you develop, But for the most part, everybody's organs are within the same location. So if we were to open up one person, let's say we were studying and performing autopsies, we would see the location of the lungs is about the same in every individual. They're about the same size. If they're about the same age, right? Because it's going to vary on age and the development. But let's say we're looking at all adults, we would see that there's a lot of similarities. There's not a lot of change. There are exceptions. There are some people that heart may be on the right side, or people that are just born with one kidney. There are situations where women have more than one uterus. They have two uteri. So there are exceptions, obviously, because we're all unique. But for the most part, we're going to put for anatomy, we're going to use the word static. Like I know, like static, you hear static, but static in that it's not really changing. Like we can expect to find that your heart at 25 is probably going to be about the same size as when you're 35. Physiology, on the other hand, your heartbeat's going to fluctuate, right? Depending on the stress that you're under, depending on whether you're running or you're at rest. So physiology changes. It changes because your organs are responding, they're reacting to whatever information they're receiving through all that stimuli. So for anatomy, you're going to put, we have usually dead specimens, dissection, and it's static, meaning it's pretty consistent from human to human. Physiology is chemical in nature. We're talking about like reactions within the body. It can also be physics. And then in physiology, we're also going to put live specimen for the most part. We need a live subject. And with physiology, it fluctuates, right? Where it changes depending on what that organ is doing at that time. Now, what they have in common, what we're going to put here in the middle, and we'll add more as we go, but for right now, what we want to add to the middle, and remember that I am recording this, so if you need to hit pause, I'll upload it. But what we can add to the middle, and let me come back to the presentation, something that will overlap is that the anatomy, it's that last part right here. The anatomy of an organ determines how it functions. So we have what's called a ball and socket joint in our shoulder and in our hip. So if you think of like a Barbie doll, or even yourself, if you've ever popped the arm out of a Barbie doll, right? You're popping it out of that shoulder joint. Well, we have the same. We have kind of have like this little, I wish I could show you. Let me show you a picture so you can visualize was, because it comes to my mind, but this may be something you've never seen before. So I want to make sure that you can visualize. So in the middle, you're going to put the structure determines the function. So a ball and socket joint is, we're going to find them in the shoulders and we're going to find them in the hip. And this joint is really cool, and it's called ball and socket because it looks like a ball. This is like the top of your arm or the top of your leg, which is the femur and the humerus. And in your shoulder and in your pelvis, you've got this little socket that it fits right into perfectly. Now I want you to try to move your arm, and I'm going to unfreeze myself like this. And this is where that middle in that middle of the Venn diagram, we're going to put the structure determines the function. And I'll come back to the PowerPoint. But I want you to kind of move your arm like this, and right, it could go round and round, and we can go out to the side. We can go like this, right? So we pretty much have joint movement all around, and in your leg too, right, in that socket. And so the reason for that is that the structure determines the function. The way that it looks, this kind of rounded shape into that little divot allows us to rotate that. We don't have those sockets all throughout the body. Like for example, if I were to use my finger, I'm limited to certain types of movement, and there are different joints that glide, and there are some that just, like if you think about your knee can really just go forward and back. And so structure determines the function. The way that that organ is put together, the way that that bone is anatomically shaped is going to determine what it does. So there is an interaction between the two. The structure determines the function, and we're putting this in the middle. Something I thought I'd share with y'all. So here we have kind of like these people awing over this corpse, and of course, I mean, I have to think the first time somebody was cut into, like, wow, like that's inside of us, you know, like there must have been so much wonder and like, whoa, what does this do? Like, oh my gosh, like that's inside me. And so they actually used to have people come into these theaters, and they would fill it up, and they would be performing an autopsy. People would kind of do that. But I wanted to talk about comas a little bit because we have so much equipment now to measure when someone's in a coma, like their heart rate, their breathing rate, their vitals. But back then, when they didn't have that, if somebody was in a coma and their breathing was very shallow or they couldn't detect the vitals because their pulse was very weak, they would get buried alive sometimes. They would be considered to be dead. And so we know of this because when graveyards were dug up, as the cities were expanded, they would find scratch marks on the inside of the coffin. And so that person was probably in a coma. As the oxygen started to deplete, maybe they woke up, right, because their body was struggling. Um, or maybe they had a brain injury or something like that. And so people started to be so scared of being buried alive that they started to bury people with a string attached to a bell. And so that person, if they woke up, right, they would ring the bell and hopefully somebody would hear it and they would come save them. And so the expression saved by the bell comes from that because these people were being saved by the ringing of the bell. So once that started happening and they realized that people were being buried alive, they started to have these death rooms where they would let the body decompose first before burying them just to make sure that that didn't happen. Super morbid, right? So crazy. Okay, so coming back into our presentation. You guys should have filled in parts of that Venn diagram and then anatomy and physiology. So just a little bit, you don't really have to write anything here, but when it comes to gross anatomy, this is just so you can see that, how they're different. We have gross and microscopic. You do have those two bullets in your notes. Microscopic is more important when we're studying the cells, and because we are made up of cells, if there's cancer, for example, or you have a tumor growing in an organ and you remove those cells, you have to decide if that's your career, right? You work in the lab and you're getting these samples that have been biopsied from a person with a lump in their breast or maybe a growth on their skin. You have to look at those cells and then decide if they're normal or abnormal. And so you're looking at the anatomy of the cell. And so that's would be where that would come into play. There's also, we didn't write this one, we don't have to developmental anatomy, and that's just the different phases of the development of the human embryo before birth. And then for physiology, I'm going to show you this video. You guys should already have it, but it's chemical and physical, so it's chemistry and physics. And so that's happening. One example is the digestive system. So in the, here are the organs. We can see them. That's anatomy. We can see their location. We can see how they're positioned. But the way that these organs work, that would be their physiology. So the acids, the enzymes involved for the digestion of fats and lipids, and well, fats are lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. So it would be difficult to study. Definitely, you couldn't study that in a dead person because how could you see food moving through the intestines once a person's deceased? And so because you can see that they're open tubes, essentially, right? It's just tubing starting at the mouth and coming out through the rectum. You can actually take cameras and study some of that, right? You can take a camera and endoscopy and study the esophagus here, maybe if you have heartburn in the stomach, or you can come in through the rectum and look at the colon for colonoscopy. But in order to actually see the digestion is very difficult in a dead individual. So there was this cool experiment that took place where this guy right here in this picture got shot in the abdomen on accident. I think he was out hunting for a job, like he was hunting this particular type of animal for fur. Anyways, he got shot in the stomach. The guy survived it, but he had a hole in his stomach. So the doctor that was treating him decided to use this as an opportunity to kind of see what would happen if he took pieces of meat and put them through the hole in the guy's stomach with a string. And so every so often he would put in these pieces of meat with the string and then pull them out and look at how much it had digestion. So he was able to study digestion in this human, in this living person. So I'm going to show you this clip. Were y'all, anybody want to jump in? Were y'all able to hear the maggot video earlier or no?
No.
No.
Okay, so I'll just have to put the captions. But anyways, the guy had a hole in his stomach, in his abdomen. And so basically the guy was just putting pieces of meat there to study it. He was studying physiology. So he drank the stomach acid himself, is like super into this experimentation. So he drank the guy's stomach acid and he was like looking at the physiology. Well, he wasn't looking at the physiology, but he was studying what was happening to the meat. And so all of that is physiology, live specimen. Kind of interesting to see that. Taking advantage of a bad situation there. What time do we head out? It's 11:56, but I don't have our schedule. I'm still getting adjusted to the time.
12:05.
12:05. Okay, so we'll go till 12 and then I'll stop so that I can have some of y'all ask questions if you have any and stick around. So you should have right now that Venn diagram complete. And here's the last part we'll look at. You have this slide pretty much in your notebook. What you do need to know is you need to have the levels memorized. You need to know that at our most basic level, we're made up of atoms. How those atoms interact eventually determine the molecules. Some examples of molecules within the human body, and I would write them down somewhere because you'll probably see this on your exam or a quiz, would be like DNA, proteins, which make muscle, carbohydrates, which give energy, lipids. All of those molecules are going to then go on to build this further. So there are some people, for example, if your DNA gets mutated because exposures in your environment, let's say, for example, just bringing up Chernobyl as an example. So when that nuclear power plant exploded, all of that radiation caused mutations in people's DNA. And the closer you were to the actual site of the explosion or the power plant, the worse the damage. So there were some people that died right away from the effects, and there were some people that died years later because the DNA eventually started to form defected cells. And so sometimes if your organelles don't work, like mitochondria, like smoothie are, you can't live. There are some people whose mitochondria are deformed, and so they die by age 5 because they can't make enough energy to stay alive or to grow. And then if your organelles don't, or if your organelles work and your DNA works, but your cells don't work, like there's something wrong with them, then that will lead to things like cancer. And so eventually affected cells, right? So I'm going to project this right here. Affected cells will cause tumors. So usually cancerous cells, they grow out of control, they reproduce too quickly, and so they start to build up on top of each other. So you'll start to notice a lump. Tumor is essentially tissue, right? It's a group of cells. And so if we were to remove this, we would see that they're abnormal. Their anatomy is abnormal, but that is how that cellular level eventually is going to affect further down upstream as we go through the levels of organization. And so a treatment for cancer would be to remove that tumor so that now you have healthy cells, just only the healthy ones that are around. But you also need treatments like chemotherapy and radiation to kill any rogue cells that broke away from the tumor or are now circulating through the body, right? Because we want those destroyed as well. And so going up the levels of organization, if the cell is affected, then that's going to affect the tissue that's formed. So if that's epithelial tissue that makes up the kidney, then now the kidney can't work. So if that kidney can't function, then you can't remove waste from your body, and so the patient's affected. So from that standpoint, as a physician, right, as a student of anatomy, you need to recognize that we're not just, oh, we're not looking at the whole person just like that, but that we're going through and trying to identify problems within the chain of organization. Okay, so you do need to have them memorized. Atoms, molecules, organelles. We'll look at some examples. I'll give you more examples when we meet again on Monday. Okay, so you don't have any homework. Make sure that you're caught up with whatever's on Google Classroom because I will be inputting grades this weekend and giving you the attendance for yesterday's assignment. I'll put it in today. And today your attendance is going to be from the Padlet. Okay, so if you did not do this, you're not going to be counted as present. So make sure that you complete it. If you want the full 100 for participation, you need to give me the most disturbing and the risks. Okay, so don't just stop at number 1. For the full credit, you need to give me the number 2 as well. All right, if you don't have any questions, we're going to leave a little early so that I have some time to address questions with those students that have them. Okay, you enjoy your weekend. Bye. I'll see you all later. I'll upload this on Google Classroom later. Take care.
Miss Pignon,
Mm-hmm.
can you
Yeah.
upload like the PowerPoint that you're using to give us the information for the slides for our interactive notebook?
I'll give you up to where I'm at. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can do
can
that.
you do that, please?
Yeah, you also have the online textbook. And I'm glad that you asked because some students may also want to be able to go back and do that. Um, so just to let you know, I am recording this so the other students can get this. In the anatomy, you click the skeleton and that's going to take you to the online textbook. And right now I'm following the order. So when you go to view online, you're going to see that you have the definition of anatomy, definition of physiology. See anatomy, gross, microscopic, and then you have the levels come next. Okay, so that's also an option. But yeah, I'll put that slide up for you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
Miss Pignon, I couldn't do the Padlet link.
Bye. Okay, let me go ahead and put it up here again.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Gabriela, Miranda, you have any questions?
No, I just had to submit the second part of the question, but I'm all done. Thank you.
Awesome. Enjoy your weekend.
You too.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. All right, Richard. So if you don't have any other questions?
No, I'm good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Enjoy your weekend. Yes,
You too.
Gabriela? Thank you. You have a question, Gabriela?